Okay, so today we are going to be chatting with Julie Scelfo. She is the director of an organization called MAMA, that stands for Mothers Against Media Addiction. I have talked very openly about devices and how we feel about device use in our home, and talking to a lot of parents of kids of all ages trying to find some sort of a balance with smartphones around their children and how to balance that with what goes on in our world and also the best interests of our children. So I'm really excited to talk to Julie about that. Before we get into it, I just want to list a few facts that I thought were interesting on Julie's website, on the MAMA website. It says 93% of teens ages 13 to 17 use social media. 78% of teens check their phones at least hourly. And 4.8 hours are the amount of time average teens spend on media each day, as well as a plethora of other information. So we're going to jump right into it. We're going to talk about all age groups and what we can do as parents and just people who know children to better the future for kids dealing with smartphones and wanting to avoid them. Julie, thank you again so much for doing this interview. I feel like this year has been filled with so many of these conversations that I've had on BDA Baby, and then also just personally in my own friend group of, how we're all managing, whether it's screen time, social media use with older children, even boundaries with ourselves and our own cell phone usage, social media usage. So I love that you took initiative to start a whole organization and campaign to really be a voice for the addiction of social media and technology and how much it's impacting our younger generation. And I want to jump right into it and I think let's start by giving everybody a preview of what MAMA does and what your goal is.
Sure. So first of all, nice to meet you, and it's nice to be here. MAMA stands for Mothers Against Media Addiction, and we are a grassroots movement of parents and allies fighting back against media addiction and creating a world where real-life experiences and interactions remain at the heart of a healthy childhood. And the reason I started MAMA was because I've been a journalist for more than 20 years, and throughout my career I reported on youth mental health and unfortunately suicide. And about 10 years ago, I reported on the role of social media in adolescent suicide on college campuses. And as sad as that was, a few years later, we began to see an uptick in suicide rates among tweens, which are children as young as 10. So right now in the United States, more 10-year-olds are dying at their own hands than from every form of cancer combined. And I'm a mom, and when I reported that story, it really shook me to my core, and I realized that things were way out of balance in this world. So, we're not anti-tech. We think tech can be helpful, it can be fun. It's just that tech isn't always the best solution, and we think that we need to prioritize the things that make us human and the things that we've known for centuries are what's best for child health and well-being, and also for adults, which is human-to-human connection and interaction.
When you're talking about media addiction, I just want to talk about what you mean by the word media, because some people think of, social media specifically. Some people think of all forms of technology, but as you just said, you don't think that all tech is bad. So when you're referring to media addiction specifically, what are you looking at with that word?
That's a great question. So, we really mean all forms of electronic media. We don't really have a problem with people who are obsessed with reading. Of course, books are a form of media as well. But what we've seen is ever since the internet and social media and the ability to carry around a supercomputer in your pocket, which is what a smartphone really is, and Wi-Fi, that we're all spending hours and hours and hours online. Many functions that we used to do through paying with cash, for example, we can now do through our phone. So what we've observed is that we're living in a society that's obsessed with media and screens. We have screens in our cars, we have screens in our restaurants, screens in elevators, in our gas pumps, and all of that information coming to us 24/7 is really overloading our brains. And scientists have found it's sort of throwing our sympathetic nervous system into what you call fight or flight. And all of that hyperstimulation is causing a lot of anxiety. It's causing our brains and bodies to never sort of return to a resting state, which has, a biological effect, and that is to put us under more stress and sort of make it harder for us to be emotionally healthy. So we're advocating for everyone to take a hard look at their use of technology and media and ask, where can you dial it back and invite more quiet space into your world, spend more time in nature and without being connected.
I love that this is also a subject matter that you're not just targeting parents about, because, I think parents are very aware of the impacts of technology on children, young children. I mean, my oldest is 4. I have a 2-year-old, and I also have a 12-year-old stepson. So I see how different it is in just that age group. But I think the idea of also looking at ourselves, whether we have kids or not, and trying to find ways that we can implement boundaries into our own lives is really important. I mean, you see so much of, even if you go on social media, you see parenting videos that talk about your kids look at you for setting an example. So somebody who's on their device all the time but has a no device policy for their children is really challenging to implement those kinds of rules. So I love the idea of really, you're speaking to mothers, of course, but also just people in general, and just having an awareness level toward our addiction to media. I always look at, the feedback people give when you're talking about a subject like this. I'm very open with, I am a big believer in loving the way that we grew up in my family with going outside, doing arts and crafts. I talk about this all the time. It's a very interesting subject matter. People get very charged by it and opinionated about it. And that's okay, of course. But when you talk about this subject and you talk about kids of all different age groups, you have a focus on tweens when it comes to suicide. And you also go back just to mental health, starting from when kids are little and even able to look at a screen, and how that goes all the way through. What is the biggest feedback or pushback that you have with people who might not be aligned with what your mission is?
So you've asked so many good questions in there. I don't even know where to start. I mean, first of all, I have to say that, I'm not here to shame anybody. I have 3 kids, and there is no parenting mistake that I haven't made at least 3 times over, probably times 1,000. My oldest son is a college student now, and when he was born, there were no iPhones, and Mark Zuckerberg worked at a small company called the Facebook. And by the time my middle son was born and I took him to pre-K, every single parent in my neighborhood had a smartphone, was on Facebook. This was before Instagram, but we were already sort of training our children that everything is worth photographing, and that it's normal to be photographed constantly and to share all of your content online. And now my youngest son just started high school, and in middle school, even before he had a phone, his friends were showing him TikToks. He was growing up in the world of TikTok because YouTube and Snap had gone to shorter and shorter reels. And so it was my generation of parents who really lived through all of those changes that children experienced in their environment. And so, the issue of modeling is something that definitely came up. It was during my lifetime and career that we went from not having mobile phones to having Blackberries to having smartphones. And I remember going to a parent-teacher conference for one of my sons, and the teacher was explaining that he wasn't really reading. He wasn't interested in reading. He was behind the other students. And my husband and I were talking that night. He's an attorney, I'm a journalist, and we realized that all day long we both read for a living, but we were doing it on our phones and they never saw us holding books or magazines or anything. And, I began to really connect the dots about how what we were doing in our society was directly affecting kids, because people forget reading is an acquired habit. And mass literacy is not a condition that's existed in this society for very long. It's only been like 100 years. So part of why I started Mama was the mental health crisis that our kids are in. And again, that's not my language. The American Academy of Pediatrics and 2 other professional groups 2 years ago declared that we're in a national emergency for youth mental health. We've been running out of pediatric psychiatric beds. There's a shortage of counselors available. But also, when it comes to our students' academic performances, we've seen reading and math scores drop to their lowest levels that they've been since we started measuring in 1971. So, when people say, well, it's inevitable, that they're going to be on screens and we're living in a digital world, so I just have to accept that. The thing I try to remind parents is, I accept that we're going to live in a highly technological society. There's no question about that. But when you think about the tech CEOs, so often we hear that they themselves send their kids to Waldorf schools where there's no technology. Or Steve Jobs a few years ago told the New York Times that his kids had never touched an iPad. Most of the tech entrepreneurs and inventors really believe, like you do, in the value of arts and crafts, play, nature, experimentation, doing things as a form of learning. So when I remind parents about that, they're usually a lot more receptive to thinking about how we can all work together to implement healthier habits.
How do you do that, though, without the judgment aspect? I always feel like when you talk about this subject matter, and I even feel like when I talk about it myself, if it's on, BDA Baby, or if it's on another podcast, or even just socially, families have different choices for their children that are different from, what I might choose for our children. So how do you have this conversation in an informative way where parents don't feel judged?
So, Katherine, if I had the perfect answer, we wouldn't be in this situation because I would have deployed it everywhere nationwide. But that issue is factored into how we built Mama. So, the way Mama works is we recruit or interview chapter leaders in individual communities, and they run their own chapters. And what that means is they're in charge of gathering people in their community who want to be part of the group, and they host 4 in-person meetings a year. And what happens when you gather in person in real life is that people begin to share their experiences, and there's a lot of space and room for sharing how hard it is to parent, because we're all struggling and we're all wanting to make sure our kids don't feel left out or our kids aren't left behind. And so that environment really helps people open up and share with their experiences. And the next part of our strategy is really to use science-backed data to educate parents about best practices. It's been sort of popular in the tech press to say, well, there isn't really evidence that social media and screen time is harmful for kids. But what that too often ignores is the decades, if not centuries, of research documenting best practices for child development. We know that pediatricians have long said no screens for anyone under 2. We know that in order for children to develop healthy attachment and relationships, they need close bonds with a caregiver. And we know that the call and response mechanism of talking to a child and responding to them when they make verbalizations, even as an infant and toddler, is critically important for their language acquisition skills. So if a parent is on a screen and not interacting with their child, we know there's a displacement of those healthy experiences. So one of the things we try to do at Mama is give people a language for talking about this stuff, because the research is there. It's just sometimes overlooked or forgotten, and we want to help bring that back to the front.
I always think it's interesting also to talk to parents of different age groups. My uncle, I have a cousin who is 15 years old, and I remember when Jonathan Haidt's book came out about the anxious generation, all about social media and technology and different generations' experiences with it. I brought it up in front of my uncle, and my uncle, I think, having a daughter who's 15, and I'm sure you can relate to this, and, parenting in a time where a lot of this information wasn't out there and people just gave their kids technology because it was what everyone was doing. And now we're all showing the data and statistics about how detrimental that is for their mental health, for their overall well-being, for anxiety levels, et cetera. I mean, the list is very long. His reaction was almost like he felt that the information was attacking him and his parenting style. And I could see the look on my cousin's face that was she got teary-eyed and almost felt like threatened by this idea of somebody taking her device away from her. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about just that reaction. I'm sure you see that a lot with parents feeling, like they didn't know any better. Did they mess up their kid for life? What can they do? And also the fact that the idea of taking the device away from their child who's used to that device will cause more harm than good.
It is hard as a parent to know that you're not always doing what's right by your children. And I remember weeping in my kitchen one night because I was finding parenting so difficult, and I was worried that I was messing up my son. And my husband came in and he said, "What's wrong?" And the nicest thing he ever said to me, I remember this moment, I said, "I'm just so worried I'm going to mess him up," although I used a coarser word than mess up. And my husband said, "Honey, we're definitely going to mess them up. That's what parents do." And I realized he was right. No matter what you do, you cannot be a perfect parent. And I think that we need to ease up on ourselves and not judge ourselves so harshly. I gave my kids smartphones when they were 12, and I waited until they were 12. And at the time, it was so hard. I had to endure them whining. I remember my son, "I'm the only child in New York City without a phone." And I remember saying, "Yes, you are the only child in New York City without a phone," because that was the only way to kind of calm him down. And it was really hard to hold out. Now, if I had known then what I know now, there is no way I would have ever given them a phone. I would have delayed it much longer. And the Surgeon General says he would wait with his own daughters. He's waiting until at least high school to consider getting them smartphones or social media. So I can imagine it was hard for your uncle to hear that and your cousin to hear that. And it is hard to learn some of this stuff. But as painful as that is, it is so much worse for the dozens and dozens of parents I've met whose children have died because they went on unregulated social media and they were sent content about eating disorders and their children developed eating disorders, or they were sent content about self-harm or choking challenges and all of these things. So by telling parents about these things, nobody's trying to scare them or shame them, but we want to make parents, first of all, aware of the real risks that are out there, and second of all, join together as a united force to stand up against sort of just complete lawlessness and complete lack of policy safeguarding social media. We make sure our food supply is safe. We make sure our vehicles are safe. We make sure our airlines are regulated. It's absolutely crazy that we don't have some basic safeguards built into social media to ensure that if it's used by a child, that the child won't get sent harmful information.
It's so interesting when you talk about, not wanting to share this information to cause fear within parents and their communities. And of course, I find it to be informative and also scary and intimidating. I go to, to different schools in our area. So many of the schools are based in technology. Granted, of course, some schools have made great decisions to, use these yonder pouches, check phones in. You see what amazing outcomes have come from that. Kids are actually talking to each other. They're having experiences that, we had when we were growing up. But I mean, are you overall really hopeful that the generation to come of kids to go through elementary school and high school will have a better experience with technology and social media and just media in general?
I am cautiously optimistic, and I say that because right now the one of the most important pieces of legislation that's come forward since the 90s, which is back when my generation was dialing up AOL with our landlines and using floppy disks. But the Kids Online Safety Act passed in the Senate by a nearly unanimous vote. I think it was 96 to 1 or something, 93 to 1. And it was a tripartisan bill. This isn't a political issue. Thankfully, the one thing left in America we all seem to agree on is that people shouldn't exploit children and products should be safe for children. It went over to the House. The House marked it up in a way that would make it a little less effective. It's now back in the Senate. But finally, it looks like it's going to pass. We need parents to call their lawmakers and demand that it passes. And this bill will become one of the first pieces of legislation that forces social media companies to limit the addictive design of their products when they're used by children. I am optimistic, first of all, because I think this legislation should pass and will pass. I'm also optimistic because unfortunately so many of the kids who have grown up in the last generation are themselves becoming activists now. There are a number of groups with youth leaders who are saying, we lived through this. This is nuts. You can't do this to other children. And so I think that is forcing a lot of folks in power to finally listen. And, it's my greatest hope that in 10 years we won't need mama. But in reality, we also have AI coming up and all of these new issues. And with each new iteration of technology, there's a whole nother set of problems to contend with. So we're seeing ChatGPT being used by students to cheat, and teachers don't have the ability to tell whether or not artificial intelligence has been used. And leaving aside even the question about cheating, the lost education that's happening is deeply concerning. It can be challenging. At my own kid's school, I went to curriculum night last week and saw many, many instances where they're using technology that it's not necessarily the best solution. And even some teachers were confiding in me. They didn't even know what I do for a living. And they were saying, like, I wish we weren't using Google Classroom. I wish the kids kept a notepad. Because there's so much evidence that handwriting, physical paper, holding books really helps with memory, and that's the critical part of learning. So hopefully more people will continue to wake up about using technology and media in a really careful way.
How can we get parents and schools and teachers all on the same page to going back to this form of learning and education that benefited all kinds of learning, especially when it comes to the younger age group where technology is really not a necessity?
Well, I think your feelings about this actually just speak to the feelings of parents nationwide. I'm contacted all the time by parents who are like, what is going on? They just gave my first grader a Chromebook. He can't even carry it yet. And then they send the first grader home with a Chromebook. Like, it makes no sense. I heard from a parent in Florida who was required to rent an iPad for her kindergartner. Why are we giving young children who do not have the developmental skills technology that costs $1,000 and expecting them to be able to maintain it, or forcing parents to be responsible for it if their child damages it? These things just don't make any sense. So I think that the more parents raise their voices and the more that we collaborate and work together, that it is empowering more educators to step back and say, wait a minute, for a long time we were focused on quote unquote closing the digital divide. And we certainly don't want there to be a digital divide, right? We think all children deserve to have the best possible resources for education. But we have more data now. Last year, UNESCO put out something called the GEM report, which is a global education monitoring report. They looked all over the world in all different countries, and they found that the presence of technology in a classroom, and this was pre-K up through 12th grade, showed no increase in improved academic outcomes, reading or math. The only evidence they could find that technology actually improved education outcomes came from a single company in the United States that makes education tech software. So, unfortunately, we're in a time where there's a lot of imbalance. The companies who make tons of profit off of these products have really pushed their way into schools. You can read their own reports that talk about schools as markets. And I think we just need to go back to prioritizing what's important, which is people and our children, and say, you know what, there might be a time and a place for some technology in curricula. There's a place to learn some computer programming. There's a place to learn about digital citizenship and appropriate behavior online.
I want to just ask one question when it comes to technology at schools. As I mentioned, I look at schools. I think, especially in elementary schools, technology makes no sense to have, especially for 5, 6-year-olds. It's just, I don't see the point. I, of course, understand as kids get older and they're doing things like robotics in school, having some sort of technology in that specific class, seems to be a necessity for certain people. But for a lot of these schools and a lot of parents, people who aren't even parents, we hear in America, unfortunately, so much of situations happening like school shootings in America, and parents and even non-parents feeling like, okay, if I send my kid to school, yes, the school is supposed to be a safe place to drop my child off, send them there, and feel comfortable and confident that they're going to be safe. And unfortunately, we have a really big problem in America that's a totally separate problem. And a lot of communication and parents feeling comfortable dropping their children off comes with, okay, they have a phone, they have a way to reach me should something terrible happen where they need to text me, call me, be in an emergency. What's your commentary or your feedback for parents who have that as being a concern when dropping their kids off, or the idea of technology not being present in schools?
So, it's an absolute legitimate concern. I have 3 kids, and the idea of a school shooting absolutely terrifies me. And in fact, my kids live in New York City, and at one of their schools, there was a shooting outside the school about 2 years ago. And it was terrifying. As a journalist, I like to get answers from experts and people who really know about this stuff. So I think 2 years ago now, I wrote a piece for San Francisco Chronicle, and I can share it with you if you want to share it with your listeners. But I went ahead and I called all the experts on school safety to learn about school shootings and what they thought about phones. And what I very quickly learned is that the experts say the presence of a phone actually puts your child more at risk, because in the event of a catastrophic emergency, like an intruder in the building, the number one most important thing is that the child is paying complete attention to their teacher or other school leaders who are going to give them commands and need them to pay attention. There are split seconds sometimes in these emergency situations. And if your child is on their phone, pulling out their phone, trying to text mom and dad, it doesn't help. They've also seen in past emergencies, whether shootings or something else, that if 500 children or 1,000 children start calling 911 at the same time, it actually jams up the lines when it's critically important that the leaders of the school can get through, and that the experts and the officials, the sheriffs, the police department, FBI, that they can get through. So in talking to parents, one of the things I've come to see, that we had a mom get up actually at our first ever meeting, and she shared that originally she didn't agree with me, that she thought phones have caused all these problems in her kid's life. And the one good thing was that she could reach them in an emergency. And then there was a drill at her child's school. It was a active shooter drill that they notified the parents about in advance, but not the children. And during it, her son started texting her. And she was on the line with him texting for like 10 minutes. And she realized in that experience that there was actually nothing she could do to physically protect him, but that it was creating this like weird thing where he wasn't actually having the experience of being present in school and listening to the teacher. And so she had completely reversed her position. And she said, now I get it. Like, it's hard. We're living in a world where we parents want to control everything. We've been told by the media and the parenting industrial complex that we should be perfect parents. We should be playing Mozart for them in the womb and speaking foreign languages to them, and that there's all these things to do to give them the best life. But what the research shows, and been the same for generation after generation, that the number one best thing for your children to have well-being in their life is to have close attachments, to have healthy relationships, to have a trusted adult. It doesn't even have to be a parent, a trusted adult in their life. And then we also need to practice letting go and giving them appropriate levels of risk and opportunity to go out in the world and learn to manage themselves. So being at school without complete access to a smartphone, I think, is critical for child's well-being. And for us parents, part of our practice should be talking to the schools and learning what the procedure is in an emergency. If there's an emergency in your own family, you can always call the school office and they can go get your child, which has worked for generations and it still works.
So I always like to leave people with conversations like this with actionable items, what they can do. Of course, we're going to link out the amazing work that you've done, and not only to the Mama website, but also just all of the speeches and activism that you're constantly doing for people to get involved in and even create or be a part of chapters in their area. What are 3 things that you can tell parents to implement in their lives to benefit their children and also help with media addiction?
The 3 action steps that parents can take in their own lives, number 1 is delay, delay, delay. The longer you can delay access to screens and personalized media and social media, the easier it will be for your children to acquire all of the building blocks of good health that will better enable them to navigate those spaces later on. It is very hard as a parent to give your kid a device and then have to take it back. But even just the act of giving them their own tablet means that they can absorb information and shows in isolation. Whereas if they're watching a show with you, with a caregiver, with a grandparent, there's many more opportunities to see what they're seeing and to provide context for what they're seeing, which kids critically need. The second thing that parents can do is model the behavior they want their children to have. So there are easy steps like ensuring you have a rule in your house with no screens at the table, making sure that all devices, all personal devices get turned off an hour before bed and stored somewhere outside the bedroom. Never ever let your child take a device with them into their own rooms at night. We've learned from Meta's own internal research that they track how many 10, 11, 12-year-olds are still online on Instagram at midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. on school nights because they can't put it down. And it's not their fault. So we as parents need to make sure and set firm rules and then model those rules for kids. And then the last thing I would say is visit us at joinmama.org and sign up. We'd love for you to start a chapter in your community or join a chapter. We have fact sheets for parents about why smartphones don't belong in schools. And we're constantly working with our local chapters who connect with their local leaders in school boards and in government to ensure that people put kids first when it comes to policies.
I love that. Thank you so much. This was such an informative conversation. I also love leaving parents with the idea of using their voice as being such a powerful part of changing this landscape for the better for their children, no matter what the age group is. and speaking up for the well-being and future of for our children. So thank you so much, Julie. This is such a big and important topic, and one that I'm so passionate about as well. And I think you're doing amazing work, and I can't wait for people to get involved and learn more about all the great work that you are doing. So thank you. Okay, well, thank you to Julie Scelfo for such an informative and great conversation. This is such a big subject right now that we are dealing with in the parenting space, but also just any space of wanting to better the future for the next generation that will really have a lot of decisions to make when it comes to smartphones and their usage, and whether we should be taking it back to flip phone era of helping kids manage what they're exposed to and help with their attention spans. So thank you to Julie. And if you're looking for more information, the organization is called MAMA, Mothers Against Media Addiction.